The fork slipped from my fingers and tapped against the plate, a small sound that somehow cut through the chatter at the table. Everyone heard it. Everyone paused. And then my daughter-in-law smiled, the kind of smile that pretends to be polite while it sharpens its edge. "You'd never dare touch our money," she said lightly, like she was commenting on the weather. The words settled in the room. No one laughed. No one corrected her. My son stared down at his glass, suddenly fascinated by the way the ice was melting. My grandson kept chewing, unaware that something invisible had just cracked open. For a moment, I thought I might say something. I felt the heat rise in my chest, the old instinct to speak, to correct, to remind everyone who I was. But the feeling passed. It drained out of me as quickly as it came, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. Because in that sentence, she hadn't just insulted me. She had revealed what she believed, that I was harmless, that I was dependent, that whatever I had once built no longer belonged to me in any way that mattered. I nodded slowly as if she'd made a reasonable point. I even smiled back. What none of them understood, not in that moment, was that I wasn't deciding whether to fight. I was deciding when to leave. And once that decision settled, everything else became very simple. I had spent 70 years learning how power really worked. I didn't raise my voice that night because I didn't need to. I already knew how this story would end. I just hadn't told them yet. I was sitting at the end of the table, close enough to hear every conversation, but far enough to feel like an afterthought. That had become my place in the house. Not assigned, just assumed. The chair they pulled out for me out of habit, not respect. From the outside, it probably looked like a normal family dinner. Good food, a clean house. The kind of scene people imagine when they talk about success. Inside, though, everything was measured. Every comment, every gesture, especially anything that involved me. I used to command rooms much larger than that dining area. Boardrooms, warehouses, meetings where millions of dollars moved based on a single decision. I had learned early on that confidence wasn't about volume. It was about certainty. And certainty, I was discovering, had quietly shifted away from me. Not because I had lost it, but because I had handed it over. My daughter-in-law sat at the head of the table beside my son. Her posture relaxed, her voice assured. She spoke the way people do when they believe the floor beneath them is solid, when money has insulated them from consequences long enough that they mistake access for ownership. She managed everything now. The schedules, the expenses, even the tone of the house. She called it being organized. I recognized it for what it was. Control dressed up as efficiency. I had once admired that kind of confidence. In the wrong hands, it curdles. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. A quiet correction here, a small reminder there. Comments about how things were done these days. Each one landed softly, but they accumulated. And because they were never dramatic, they were easy to dismiss, even easier to excuse. At least that's what I told myself. My son had changed in ways that were subtle enough to deny, but consistent enough to notice. He used to speak directly. Now he spoke carefully. We decided replaced, I think. When I asked questions, he glanced at her first, as if checking for approval. That hurt more than I expected it to. Not because I needed to be consulted, but because it told me where I stood. I wasn't part of the decision-making anymore. I was part of the background. I told myself it was temporary, that families go through phases, that stepping back was the price of peace. I had retired after all. I had chosen to slow down. I believed, foolishly, that choice would be honored. Instead, it was interpreted as surrender. The house itself reminded me daily that I was a guest. Not unwelcome, just unnecessary. I didn't have a key of my own. My room was tidy but impersonal, like a hotel that expected me to check out eventually. Even my belongings seemed to exist on borrowed space. Money became the leash they never admitted they were holding. Monthly allowances framed as help. Casual questions about what I needed, what I spent. always delivered with a smile, always justified as concern. At first, I accepted it. Pride has a way of convincing you that endurance is virtue. I told myself it was easier this way, that I didn't want to make waves, that my grandson's laughter in the afternoons was worth any discomfort. And then she said that sentence. "You'd never dare touch our money." There it was. The assumption laid bare. Not just that I wouldn't, but that I couldn't. That whatever role I had played in the creation of their comfort had expired the moment I stepped aside. I looked around the table after she spoke. I saw relief in a few faces, discomfort in others, but no opposition. No one challenged her. That silence told me everything I needed to know. I didn't feel small in that moment. I felt clear. Clarity is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in like dust after a collapse. Suddenly you can see the shape of what's broken. I realized then that I had been trying to belong in a place that had already decided what I was worth. I had mistaken tolerance for respect, hospitality for gratitude. I thought about the years I spent building something from nothing. About contracts I read line by line while others skimmed. About the difference between authority granted and authority retained. I had never confused the two, until now. When dinner ended, I helped clear the table. Old habits die hard. My daughter-in-law thanked me absently, already planning something on her phone. My son avoided my eyes. I went to my room that night and closed the door quietly. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the house settle around me. Pipes clicking, footsteps overhead. The sound of a life that no longer required my participation. I didn't pack, not yet. I didn't make any calls. I didn't need to. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, replaying her words, not with anger, but with interest. They were the kind of words people say when they believe they are untouchable, when they believe they understand the limits of someone else's reach. She had no idea how wrong she was. That night, I stopped thinking of myself as a burden. I stopped thinking of myself as a father trying to be included. I stopped thinking of myself as anything they had defined. I became something else entirely. By the time the house went quiet, I had already decided. I wouldn't argue. I wouldn't plead. I wouldn't announce my departure or explain my reasons. I would simply step away. And when I did, everything they thought was solid would begin to shift. Not because I was angry, but because I was done pretending I had no power. She believed I would never dare touch their money. She was right about one thing. I didn't dare. I planned. I used to believe that family was safer than paper, that trust carried more weight than signatures, that if you raised your children well and gave them everything you had, respect would follow naturally. That belief shaped the way I retired. When I stepped away from the company, I didn't do it because I was tired or confused. I did it because I thought I had reached the part of life where my role was to make room, not hold space. I had spent decades building something that fed hundreds of families. Letting my son take the reins felt like the final proof that I had done my job right. I told myself I wasn't giving up control. I was giving him confidence. I wanted to be the kind of father who trusted his child enough to step back. The kind who didn't hover, didn't interfere, didn't make every decision feel like a test. I had seen too many men cling to power long past the moment they should have let go, and I swore I would never become one of them. So I retired cleanly. No drama, no lingering authority in the background. I stayed available for advice, but never insisted on being heard. I believed that generosity would be met with loyalty. That was my mistake. The years before that decision hadn't been easy. I built the company the hard way, mile by mile, contract by contract. I remember driving long hours between warehouses to eating meals out of paper bags, negotiating with people who smiled while sharpening knives behind their backs. I learned early on that being underestimated could be an advantage if you stayed patient. Banks questioned me. Competitors dismissed me. More than once I was told I was reaching beyond my limits. Every time I listened, carefully, nodded politely, and did the work anyway. That company didn't survive because of luck. It survived because I read everything I signed, because I planned for failure, even when things were going well, and because I never assumed tomorrow would look like today. I carried that mindset into retirement, even if my family didn't see it. When I handed over leadership to my son, it wasn't a single moment. It was a process. Gradual, structured, deliberate. Responsibilities shifted in stages. Authority expanded with performance. On the surface, it looked simple. Behind the scenes, it was anything but. I didn't announce safeguards. I didn't dramatize them. I didn't frame them as mistrust. They were simply part of the structure, the same way seatbelts are part of a car. You don't expect to crash, but you don't remove them just because the road looks clear. I thought stepping back would earn me a different kind of respect. Not fear, not obedience, just recognition. The quiet understanding that I had chosen to trust, not that I had been pushed aside. Instead, I slowly disappeared. At first it was subtle. Conversations about the business happened without me in the room. Financial decisions were presented as updates, not discussions. I told myself this was natural, that this was what I wanted. That involvement wasn't the same as relevance. When I moved into my son's house, I told myself it was temporary. A practical choice. Downsizing made sense. Being closer to family made sense. I was proud of the life he had built, the comfort he could now provide. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly my presence would be reclassified. My daughter-in-law was efficient, organized, confident. She ran the household the way a manager runs a department, with systems and rules that left little room for ambiguity. At first, I admired that. It reminded me of the discipline it takes to keep things from unraveling. But discipline without empathy hardens. The first time I noticed the shift was small enough to ignore. A comment about budgeting. A suggestion that I didn't need to worry about certain expenses anymore. It was framed as kindness, relief. One less thing for me to think about. I thanked her. The second time came a week later. A gentle reminder about spending habits. A recommendation for more appropriate choices. Still polite, still reasonable, still easy to dismiss. I told myself she meant well. It took longer than I care to admit to realize what was happening. Control doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in dressed as concern, justified as efficiency. By the time you recognize it, it's already been normalized. My son didn't question any of it. Why would he? Things were running smoothly. The house was calm. Money wasn't a problem. He trusted his wife the same way I had trusted him. He never asked to see the details, never asked what assumptions were being made. When people believe something is permanent, they stop checking the locks. I watched him sign documents without reading them closely. Watched him nod through explanations without asking follow-up questions. Not because he was careless, but because he was comfortable. Comfort dulls curiosity. There were moments when I considered speaking up, when I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to correct a misunderstanding or assert a boundary. Each time I held back. I told myself it wasn't worth the tension, that I didn't want to become a problem, that silence cost me more than I expected. The truth is, aging teaches you how invisible you can become. Not overnight, but gradually. You notice people finishing your sentences for you, making decisions on your behalf, praising you for being agreeable, for not causing trouble. I stayed quiet because I didn't want to lose access to my grandson, because I didn't want to be labeled difficult, because I believed endurance was a form of love. What I didn't realize was that my silence was being misread. They didn't see restraint. They saw surrender. They assumed that because I no longer held daily authority, I no longer held any authority at all, that the systems I had built belonged to them now simply because they were using them. That control once delegated could never be reclaimed. That assumption would eventually undo them. I never handed myself over. I handed over responsibility, not identity. There is a difference, and it's one too many people fail to understand until it's too late. By the time my daughter-in-law felt confident enough to make that comment at the table, she wasn't being reckless. She was being honest. She was speaking from a place of certainty, built on years of unchallenged control. She believed I was finished. What she didn't know was that I had spent my entire life preparing for moments exactly like that. Moments when clarity arrives, when respect dissolves, when trust proves misplaced. I had learned long ago that the most dangerous thing you can do is assume someone else has stopped paying attention. That night, lying in my borrowed room, I didn't feel regret. I felt recognition. The quiet understanding that something had reached its natural end. I had stepped aside willingly. I had trusted freely. I had stayed silent longer than necessary. And now I was done doing all three. The house was beautiful, in the way expensive things often are, polished, spacious, carefully arranged to signal success. From the outside, it looked like a reward. From the inside, it felt like a waiting room. Nothing in it was mine. I didn't choose the furniture or the paint on the walls. I didn't know where things were kept unless I was told. Even the keys on the counter weren't for me. I had access but not ownership. Permission, not belonging. My room was clean and quiet, the kind of room designed to make you comfortable without letting you forget you were temporary. The bedspread never wrinkled. The closet held only what I brought with me. I learned quickly to keep my things contained, as if spreading out might be interpreted as overstepping. At first I told myself this was normal. I was living in my son's home. Of course it wouldn't feel like mine. Pride whispered that I should be grateful. Age reminded me that making a fuss would only complicate things. So I adapted. Adaptation is a subtle surrender. You don't notice it happening. You just start asking fewer questions. You accept more explanations. You learn which opinions are welcome and which are politely ignored. Money was the first thing to change. Not dramatically, not all at once. It arrived as convenience. "We'll just handle the bills," my daughter-in-law said one afternoon, smiling as she scrolled through something on her phone. "So you don't have to worry about it." I nodded. It sounded reasonable, helpful even. Soon after came the allowances, monthly transfers framed as support. "Enough to cover what I needed," she said. "Enough to keep things simple." When I thanked her, she waved it off as if generosity were a minor administrative task. Then came the questions, not accusations. Just curiosity. Where I shopped, what I bought, whether I really needed certain things. The tone was always light, always practical. It would have seemed paranoid to object. I told myself she was being responsible. But responsibility doesn't require oversight of every receipt. It doesn't need to be reaffirmed in front of others. It doesn't disguise authority as kindness. I noticed how my choices began to shrink. Which stores were considered too expensive? Which purchases were labeled unnecessary? How often I heard phrases like, "in this phase of life," and "what's best for you." Each one landed softly. Together, they formed a cage. The humiliations were small, carefully placed, easy to miss unless you were the one collecting them. A correction here delivered with a laugh, a reminder there disguised as advice. Being spoken over during conversations that brushed too close to finances or decisions. Once I reached for a bill at a restaurant out of habit more than intent. My daughter-in-law gently placed her hand over mine and said, "We've got this," as if I were a child reaching for something sharp. The table went quiet. I withdrew my hand and smiled, feeling something inside me fold. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was past proving anything, that dignity was about letting go. But dignity without autonomy is just obedience with better manners. My son noticed none of it, or pretended not to. He trusted his wife completely. When she spoke, he listened. When she decided, he agreed. If I raised a concern, he softened. It reframed it, diluted it, until it disappeared. "We're just trying to make things easier," he would say, as if ease were the highest virtue. The way he spoke had changed. Not just the words, but the rhythm. He used to talk to me as a peer, even when we disagreed. Now he sounded like a messenger delivering decisions that had already been made elsewhere. It felt like watching him drift away without leaving the room. I grieved that more than the loss of money, more than the loss of space. Losing your son to silence is a quiet kind of pain. There's no argument to point to, no moment you can mark as the end. Just a gradual absence where connection used to live. There were days I considered pushing back, drawing a line, reasserting myself if only to feel solid again. Each time I hesitated, I was afraid of becoming expendable. I had seen how easily people labeled older men as difficult, how quickly concern turned into impatience. I didn't want to risk my place in my grandson's life. I didn't want to give them a reason to say I was ungrateful, unreasonable, a problem to manage. So I stayed quiet. What they never understood was that my silence wasn't confusion. It was observation. I watched how decisions were made, who held the final word, how money flowed and where it paused. I noticed the unspoken rules of the house, the ones no one announced, but everyone enforced. Gratitude was mandatory. Questions were disrespect. Independence was framed as ingratitude. Agreement was praised. Resistance was managed. They expected me to shrink, to adapt endlessly, to become smaller, until I fit neatly into the role they had designed for me. The harmless old man, the dependent parent, the obligation they tolerated out of duty, not respect. What they didn't account for was my memory. I remembered how systems worked, how authority was structured, how control was often invisible until it was removed. I remembered that dependence, when engineered, could also be undone. Each time my daughter-in-law corrected me, each time my son deferred, each time my choices were narrowed in the name of efficiency, I took note. Not with resentment, but with clarity. They believed they were training me. In reality, they were revealing themselves. The lie they lived by was simple: that because I relied on them for daily life, I was helpless. That because I accepted limits, I had none left to set. That because I stayed quiet, I had nothing to say. They mistook patience for weakness, accommodation for surrender. I had built an entire career watching people make that mistake. One evening, after another small correction delivered with a smile, I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. The house hummed around me, full of activity that no longer required my participation. I realized then that I wasn't just living on permission, I was being managed. That understanding didn't make me angry. It made me still. Because when you finally see the shape of the cage, you also see the door. I didn't know yet how I would leave. I didn't know when. But I knew I would not stay as I was. The role they had assigned me was not one I had agreed to play forever. They believed dependence meant helplessness. They were wrong. Dependence had been constructed carefully, layer by layer. And anything constructed could be dismantled just as carefully when the time was right. I went to sleep that night without making a sound, without changing a single thing. To them, nothing had shifted. But inside me, the balance had already tipped. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I was waiting for the right moment. I chose a gift that couldn't be spent. That decision came to me quietly one morning while I was watching my grandson build something on the living room floor. He was patient in the way children sometimes are. When they cared deeply about the outcome, he lined things up, knocked them over, started again without complaint. I saw myself in that rhythm, the long view, the willingness to wait. Cash would have been easy. A check, an envelope, a brief moment of gratitude before it disappeared into someone else's system. I didn't want that. I wanted something that would still exist after moods changed and arguments cooled. Something that wouldn't invite oversight or permission. I wanted to give him time. So I chose an investment structured to grow quietly, untouched, meant for his future rather than his present. Not flashy, not liquid. The kind of gift that teaches patience without saying a word. The kind that doesn't beg for approval. To me, it wasn't money. It was a message. I had spent my life choosing stability over spectacle, building slowly, steadily, with an eye on what lasts when excitement fades. I wanted my grandson to inherit that instinct, not just a balance. I wanted him to understand that value compounds when you let it. I didn't tell anyone right away. I didn't announce it at dinner or frame it as generosity. I planned to explain it to him when he was old enough to understand, and to his parents when the moment felt right. I wasn't sneaking. I was protecting the intent. That protection didn't last long. The first time my daughter-in-law asked about it, her tone was casual, almost friendly. She wanted details, structure, timing. She asked questions the way someone does when they're mapping a space, not exploring it. I answered simply. I explained that it was long-term, that it wasn't meant to be accessed anytime soon, that it was for him. She nodded, smiling, but her eyes didn't soften. "That's a lot of responsibility," she said. "Don't you think we should coordinate things like that?" Coordinate? A harmless word dressed up to sound cooperative. I felt the familiar pressure behind it. The suggestion that independence was inefficient. I told her it was a gift, not an intervention. That it didn't change anything about their plans or their authority. She laughed lightly and let the subject drop. But something had shifted. From that point on, the gift became a reference point. Not spoken about directly, but present in the room. I could feel it every time finances came up, every time future plans were discussed. It was a variable she hadn't approved, and that bothered her more than she cared to admit. When I tried to explain the meaning behind it to my son, he listened politely, the way you listen when you've already accepted someone else's framing. "She's just worried about consistency," he said. "We don't want to confuse him. Confuse him." As if patience were a foreign concept. As if learning to wait were a threat. I realized then that he wasn't responding to me. He was repeating something he'd already agreed with. My words were arriving late to a conversation that had already ended. That hurt more than I expected. I had always believed my role as a father would evolve, not disappear. That even as my son grew into his own authority, there would be space for counsel, for values passed along quietly. Instead, I was watching that space be closed off, one reasonable explanation at a time. The gift wasn't confusing anyone. It was challenging a hierarchy. To my daughter-in-law, money was a system to be managed, centralized, approved. Anything that moved outside that system felt like interference. She didn't see the gift as generosity. She saw it as loss of control. I recognized that instinct immediately. I had seen it in competitors who tried to suffocate innovation by regulating it to death. In managers who feared anything they couldn't track. Control hates what it can't touch. I said nothing. I didn't argue. I didn't insist. I let her believe she had won that small, quiet battle. Silence. I had learned is often misread as compliance. Inside, though, I was paying attention. I was noting the way the gift had revealed fault lines in the family structure. How quickly something meant for the future had been framed as a present inconvenience. How easily authority reached for justification. The tension didn't erupt immediately. It simmered. Comments became sharper. Jokes landed with an edge. My choices were questioned more openly, my relevance more subtly undermined. The gift hovered over all of it, an unspoken reminder that I still had agency, even if they pretended otherwise. One afternoon, I overheard my daughter-in-law talking on the phone, her voice low but firm. I wasn't meant to hear it, but walls have a way of carrying truth. "We need to be careful," she said. "He still thinks he has a say." There it was. Not anger, not fear, just calculation. I sat on my bed and let that sentence settle. He still thinks. As if belief were the problem. As if the issue weren't whether I had a say, but whether they had successfully convinced me I didn't. That was when I understood why the gift bothered her so much. It wasn't about money or planning or consistency. It was about precedent. about what it implied. It implied that I still saw myself as someone with the right to give, to decide, to act independently. It implied that my role hadn't ended just because they wanted it to. And that was intolerable. I could have confronted her then. I could have demanded respect, insisted on my intentions, forced the issue into the open. Part of me wanted to. The old instinct flared, the one that solves problems through direct engagement. But I knew better. Confrontation would have turned me into the aggressor. It would have validated the narrative that I was interfering, overstepping, unwilling to let go. I would have lost the moral ground I didn't even realize I was standing on. So I stayed quiet. I let her assume that my restraint meant retreat. I let her believe the gift would be sidelined, absorbed, neutralized. I allowed the tension to resolve in her favor, at least on the surface. That miscalculation would matter later. The truth is, gifts reveal more about families than money ever does. They expose assumptions, fears, expectations that usually stay hidden. Who gets to give? Who gets to decide? Who is trusted with the future? By trying to take that gift away, even symbolically, my daughter-in-law crossed a line she didn't see. She challenged not my generosity, but my authority over my own intent. I went to bed that night knowing something had changed, not outwardly. The house was still calm. Routines continued. Smiles were exchanged. But the story had shifted. The gift had done its work even if it never changed hands. It had shown me exactly where I stood and exactly what I was up against. And once you understand that, you stop trying to be liked. You start preparing to be free. She chose the setting carefully. It wasn't an argument that spiraled out of control or a comment that slipped by accident. It was a family gathering meant to look effortless. Enough relatives to make it public. Enough comfort to disguise intention. The kind of occasion where everyone behaves just well enough to pretend nothing is wrong. I felt it before anyone spoke. The tension sat under the laughter, thin but deliberate. Conversations overlapped, but eyes kept drifting back to me, waiting. I had learned to recognize that look. It's the look people wear when they're about to make a point and want witnesses. My daughter-in-law was relaxed, confident, holding court the way she always did. She laughed easily, moved gracefully between conversations, her presence filling the room. She didn't need to dominate openly. She already believed she owned the space. When the topic shifted to my grandson, I felt it coming. Someone asked about plans for his future. College opportunities. The usual things people say when they want to sound thoughtful without committing to anything. My daughter-in-law smiled and took the lead, listing plans that were tidy and approved, framed as certainty rather than possibility. Then she glanced at me. And of course, she said lightly, we've had to be careful about outside influences. The room laughed politely. A few people nodded, not entirely sure what they were agreeing with. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear but with recognition. She was warming up. She referenced my gift without naming it, turning it into a punchline disguised as prudence. Something about old-fashioned ideas, about how times had changed, about how managing money responsibly meant centralizing decisions. Each comment landed softly wrapped in humor, leaving me little room to respond without seeming defensive. I watched my son as she spoke. He smiled faintly, eyes flicking between us, uncomfortable but silent. He didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect. He didn't meet my gaze. That silence was louder than anything she said. Then she delivered it clean and unhurried. You'd never dare touch our money. Not sharp, not angry, just certain. The room went still. Not silent exactly, but suspended. I could feel everyone processing the moment, deciding how to interpret it, where to stand. I looked around. No one corrected her. No one laughed it off. No one said my name. In that pause, something in me detached. I had spent years being patient, years absorbing small cuts disguised as kindness. I had endured because I believed the discomfort was temporary, because I thought the relationship mattered more than my pride. In that instant, I understood the truth. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about hierarchy. She wasn't joking. She was declaring. She believed the money defined ownership. That because I no longer handled daily operations, I had forfeited any claim to influence. That the systems I built were now barriers keeping me out, rather than structures holding everything up. She believed I was afraid. I felt a familiar urge rise in me, the instinct to speak, to correct the narrative, to remind her who I was and what I had done. The words lined up easily in my mind. Facts, history, context. I let them go, because I realized something else in that moment. Responding would give her what she wanted. A reaction, a defense, proof that her words had power. Instead, I smiled, not the strained smile of someone humiliated, but a small, controlled one. The kind that unsettles people because it doesn't fit the moment. I nodded once slowly, as if she had made an obvious observation. The conversation stumbled forward after that. Someone changed the subject. Plates were cleared. Laughter returned thinner than before. But the damage was done. I became invisible at that table, not ignored exactly, more like dismissed. As if my presence no longer required acknowledgement. They spoke over me, around me, past me. I existed as an object in the room, not a participant. I watched my son avoid my eyes, his discomfort obvious, but unresolved. He didn't defend me. He didn't challenge her. In that moment, I understood that his silence was a choice, even if he didn't see it that way. That hurt more than her words ever could. I felt something settle inside me, heavy but stable. The anger I expected never arrived. In its place came clarity. I saw the situation for what it was, stripped of excuses. I wasn't being tolerated out of love. I was being managed out of convenience. My presence was acceptable only as long as it didn't challenge the structure she controlled. And she had just made it clear that she believed I couldn't. What I did not do mattered as much as what I did. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't correct her. I didn't appeal to history or loyalty. I didn't demand respect or threaten consequences. I didn't need to. Because in her certainty, she had made a fatal mistake. She assumed my restraint was fear, that my age had softened me into compliance, that my silence meant consent. She believed I wouldn't dare because she believed I couldn't. That belief gave her confidence, and confidence, when misplaced, becomes blindness. As the evening wound down, I helped clean up out of habit. Someone thanked me. Someone else patted my shoulder, a gesture that felt more like closure than kindness. My daughter-in-law avoided looking at me directly. She didn't need to. In her mind, the matter was settled. I walked back to my room quietly, each step measured. The house buzzed with post-dinner energy conversations, drifting through hallways that no longer felt like mine. I sat on the bed and took a long breath. That was the last time I would be spoken to that way. Not because I planned to confront her. Not because I intended to reclaim my place at the table. But because I was done playing a role that required permission. The humiliation had been public by design. She wanted witnesses. She wanted my submission to be visible. What she didn't realize was that public moments have a way of clarifying private decisions. I wasn't angry. I wasn't wounded beyond repair. I wasn't plotting revenge in the way she might have imagined. I was finished. Finished explaining. Finished accommodating. Finished shrinking. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of years lift in an unexpected way. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. She thought that sentence ended the conversation. In reality, it ended my participation. I didn't need permission to leave, and I certainly didn't need permission to act. That night, I crossed a line without anyone noticing. I stopped reacting. And once you stop reacting, everything changes. I stayed seated long after the conversation moved on. Plates were cleared. Someone laughed too loudly. Chairs scraped against the floor as people shifted and stood. Around me, the evening tried to recover its shape, but I no longer fit inside it. I wasn't offended. I wasn't even embarrassed. I was simply no longer there in the way a father is supposed to be there. That realization landed gently, like a door closing without a slam. I watched my daughter-in-law gather dishes, efficient as always, her confidence intact. She didn't glance in my direction. She didn't need to. In her mind, the matter had been settled. Boundaries asserted. Hierarchy confirmed. My son hovered nearby, helping where he could, saying little. I could feel the distance between us more clearly than ever. Not physical distance, something deeper, a separation of roles. I had been reduced to a presence without authority. I didn't feel the urge to reclaim it. When I finally stood, no one noticed. I moved toward the hallway, quietly passing through the house, the way you pass through a place you once lived but no longer recognize. The walls were familiar. The sounds were familiar. But I was already separate from them. In my room, I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, listening. Voices downstairs, laughter, the television turning on, life continuing without interruption. I understood then that my role hadn't just been diminished. It had expired. I had been holding on to the idea that I was still needed, that endurance would eventually be rewarded, that patience would be recognized as love. That belief dissolved in the silence. They didn't want a father. They wanted a fixture. A quiet, compliant presence that validated their image of generosity without challenging their authority. I wasn't angry about that. I was relieved. Anger requires investment. It assumes the relationship can still be negotiated. What I felt was acceptance, clear-eyed and final. I sat on the bed and looked around the room. The few things I had brought with me were neatly arranged, easy to gather. I realized how intentional that had been, even before I knew why. Some part of me had been preparing long before my mind caught up. I thought about waking my son, about knocking on his door, asking him to talk, giving him one last chance to step into the space between us. The thought passed quickly. Explanations only matter when respect exists. I wasn't leaving to punish him. I wasn't leaving to teach a lesson. I was leaving because staying would require me to keep pretending that this arrangement was acceptable. It wasn't. I didn't announce my decision. I didn't write a note. I didn't gather anyone for a conversation. Dramatic exits are just another form of negotiation, and I was done negotiating. Instead, I began to disappear the way people do when they've thought things through. Quietly, I sorted through my belongings with care, not urgency. Documents that were mine went into a folder. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was taken that didn't belong to me. I made copies of what I already had access to. Years of habit guided my hands. I packed a small bag, enough for a few days. Nothing that would draw attention. I left the rest exactly where it was. I wanted nothing to look disturbed. Downstairs, the house settled into its nighttime routine. Doors closed, lights dimmed, the familiar rhythm of a household confident in its stability. I waited until everything went quiet. Leaving the room felt less like sneaking and more like concluding something properly. I paused once in the hallway, listening to the hum of the house. For a moment, I remembered what it had felt like to come home after long trips, tired, but welcomed. That feeling was gone. I moved toward the door without hesitation. The handle turned smoothly in my hand. The night air met me on the other side, cool and steady. I stepped out and closed the door softly behind me. I didn't look back. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was simply removing myself from a role that no longer existed. I walked a few blocks before stopping, my bag light on my shoulder. The street was quiet. The world felt larger than it had in years. I took a breath and felt something loosen in my chest. For the first time in a long while, no one was waiting for me to comply. I didn't call anyone that night. I didn't answer messages when they began to come in. At first they were casual, a missed call, a text asking where I was. I ignored them. Silence has weight. It creates space where certainty used to live. I knew they would escalate. Irritation would give way to concern. Concern would harden into fear. That was inevitable. I had seen it happen in business, in negotiations, where one side suddenly realizes the other has walked away from the table. I let that realization belong to them. There was a time when I would have felt guilty for causing that uncertainty, when I would have rushed to reassure to smooth things over. That impulse was gone. This wasn't abandonment. It was closure. I found a quiet place to stay, nothing elaborate. A temporary pause, not a destination. I slept deeply that night, the kind of sleep that comes after a long decision finally made. In the morning, I checked my phone once. The messages had multiplied. The tone had changed. Questions replaced assumptions. Requests replaced expectations. I turned the phone off. They had spent years managing me through access, through permission, through subtle control. Now, for the first time, they had none of it. I understood then that disappearance wasn't about distance. It was about removing leverage. By leaving without explanation, without argument, without emotional display, I had taken something essential away from them. The ability to define the narrative. They would tell themselves stories. That I was upset. That I was confused. That I would come back once I cooled off. They needed those stories to protect themselves from the truth. The truth was simpler. I had stopped being their father because they had stopped treating me like one, and in that space I had found myself again. As I sat there alone but steady, I felt no triumph, no bitterness, just alignment. I had stepped out of a life that required me to shrink, and in doing so, I had reclaimed something far more valuable than comfort. I had reclaimed myself. They would feel the absence soon enough. Not because I wanted them to suffer, but because absence has a way of revealing how much weight someone was carrying without recognition. I didn't know yet what would happen next. I didn't need to. The hardest part was over. I had walked out as their father. I had walked forward as my own man. Retirement was never surrender. That was the myth. They built their confidence on the quiet assumption that once I stepped back, everything I had built became theirs by default. They believed authority expired with age, that distance from daily operations meant distance from ownership, that trust was the same as abandonment. I had never believed any of that. There is a difference between letting someone drive and handing them the keys forever. I understood that distinction long before I ever stepped aside. I had learned it the hard way, watching partnerships collapse and promises dissolve when circumstances changed. So when I retired, I didn't erase myself from the structure. I adjusted my position within it. Transitions were documented. Responsibilities were defined. Authority was layered, not dissolved. I didn't announce any of it, because safeguards only work when they're treated as normal, not exceptional. They weren't signs of mistrust. They were signs of experience. People confuse generosity with carelessness. I never did. I had watched my son grow into leadership, watched him take pride in the title of the office, the confidence that comes with being in charge. I wanted that for him. I wanted him to feel capable, respected, unburdened by the shadow of his father. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly comfort would replace curiosity. He never asked questions about the documents he signed, never asked why certain provisions existed or when they might matter. He trusted that the structure was permanent because it had always been there. That kind of trust isn't earned. It's assumed. And assumption is dangerous. I remembered the meetings where these arrangements were put in place, the careful language chosen, the contingencies designed to remain dormant unless needed. I remembered insisting on them not because I expected betrayal, but because I understood how power shifts when respect erodes. Those clauses were never meant to punish. They were meant to protect, to preserve integrity when leadership failed, when authority was misused, when trust became leverage instead of responsibility. They slept quietly in the background for years, unnoticed and unremarkable, until respect died. I had watched that happen slowly, long before the dinner table humiliation. It wasn't a single act, but a pattern. Decisions made without transparency. Finances treated as personal entitlement rather than stewardship. Control exercised for convenience, not care. None of it triggered action on its own. Systems don't respond to feelings. They respond to conditions. And those conditions had been met. The irony was that I could have acted sooner. I could have intervened at the first sign of overreach, at the first correction disguised as kindness. But timing matters more than speed. Acting too early would have turned the issue into a debate, a misunderstanding, something that could be smoothed over with apologies and promises. I didn't want explanations. I wanted clarity. So I waited. I waited until confidence hardened into arrogance, until routines became habits, until the belief that everything was untouchable settled in completely. I waited until no one imagined there could be consequences beyond a raised voice or a hurt feeling. That was the moment when correction would be most effective. People often confuse revenge with destruction. They imagine rage, impulsive acts, damage for damage's sake. That was never my intent. I wasn't interested in burning anything down. I was interested in reclaiming what had been misused. There is a difference. Revenge seeks to hurt. Reclamation seeks to restore balance. One is emotional. The other is deliberate. I chose the latter because it left no room for argument. Everything I planned to do existed within the structure they relied on. Nothing would be taken illegally. Nothing would be seized out of spite. Control would simply return to its origin the way water finds its level when a dam is removed. The switch had always been there. They just never believed I would touch it. That belief gave them comfort. It made them careless. It allowed them to mistake my silence for incapacity, my distance for detachment. They were wrong on both counts. As I sat alone after leaving the house, reviewing confirmations and timelines, I felt no surge of anger. No excitement. Just focus. The same calm I used to feel before major decisions, when emotion had no place and clarity mattered most. This wasn't personal. It was necessary. I thought about my son, about how he would react when reality interrupted his assumptions. I felt sadness, not satisfaction. He had inherited more than assets. He had inherited blind spots. Those blind spots would now be exposed. As for my daughter-in-law, I understood her confidence. She believed control was permanent because no one had ever challenged it. She had mistaken access for ownership, convenience for authority. She believed systems exist to serve those who use them. She had never considered that systems also correct misuse. I didn't need to confront her. I didn't need to explain anything. Contracts are patient. They don't argue. They don't raise their voices. They simply wait for the conditions they were designed to address. Those conditions had arrived. The idea that retirement meant surrender had allowed them to build their world on borrowed ground. When that ground shifted, it would feel sudden to them, even though nothing about it was sudden at all. I took one last look at the framework, at the safeguards everyone had forgotten, and felt a quiet sense of inevitability. This wasn't a reaction to humiliation. The humiliation had simply clarified my willingness to act. The mechanisms themselves had been waiting far longer than that. The truth is, the most dangerous power is the kind people stop noticing. The kind that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't demand recognition, that waits quietly until it's needed. I had spent a lifetime building that kind of power. They had spent years believing it no longer existed. The next step would not be loud. There would be no confrontation, no warning shot. The change would arrive the way all effective corrections do, through process rather than spectacle. When they felt it, it would already be too late to prevent. I closed the file and set the device aside, my mind steady. The decision had been made long before that night at the table. All that remained was execution. They thought retirement had made me passive. They thought stepping back had made me irrelevant. They thought the switch was gone. It wasn't. And now I was finally ready to use it. Disappearing didn't mean running. I didn't leave in a rush, didn't drive through the night with panic pressing on my chest. There was no urgency in what I did, no desperation. I wasn't trying to escape anything. I was removing myself from a position that no longer served me. Disappearance, I learned, is not about distance. It's about absence of access. The first hours after I left were almost peaceful. I settled into a place that was quiet, unremarkable, and anonymous in the best way. No one there knew my history. No one expected anything from me. I set my bag down, washed my hands, and sat by the window, watching the day move on without my participation. My phone stayed silent at first. That didn't surprise me. They assumed I'd stepped out for air, gone for a walk, taken time to cool off. That was how they had always framed my silence before, as something temporary, something that would resolve itself without effort on their part. I let them believe that. I made coffee and drank it slowly. The calm felt unfamiliar at first, like a muscle I hadn't used in years. There was no schedule to follow, no quiet pressure to be agreeable, no sense of being monitored. When the first message came, I didn't read it. I didn't need to. I already knew its tone, casual concern wrapped around expectation. A question that wasn't really a question because it assumed a response. I left it unanswered and went back to my seat. By late afternoon, the messages multiplied. Calls followed. The silence on my end stretched heavy and deliberate. I understood what that silence was doing on the other side of the line. It was dismantling certainty. They had always relied on my availability. Even when they controlled the terms, they counted on the fact that I was there, reachable, predictable. That predictability was a form of leverage I had never noticed until I removed it. I imagined the shift in the house as the hours passed. At first, irritation. Why wasn't I responding? Then concern disguised as annoyance. Finally, the first real flicker of unease. The realization that I hadn't told anyone where I was going. That I hadn't left instructions. That I hadn't reassured them. That realization would feel foreign, uncomfortable. I didn't enjoy that thought. I simply acknowledged it. I let the silence stretch, because silence forces people to confront their assumptions. It creates space where control used to live. In that space, questions appear, and with them, fear. I knew fear would arrive quietly at first. A tightening in the chest, a change in tone. Messages that began to ask rather than tell. When I finally glanced at my phone that evening, I saw it happening already. The language had shifted. No more casual check-ins. No more implied authority, just uncertainty. Please call us. That was new. I set the phone face down and turned it off. Disappearing isn't about vanishing completely. It's about choosing what you allow to reach you. I still had access to information. I still observed. I just did it from a distance that protected my clarity. I checked emails. Confirmations came in quietly, exactly as expected. No alarms, no drama. Just acknowledgments from systems that don't care about feelings. That night, I slept deeply. The next morning, the world looked unchanged. Sunlight filtered through the window. Traffic moved. People went about their routines. The collapse I had set in motion hadn't announced itself yet, and that was intentional. I did nothing that day. Waiting is uncomfortable for people who rely on momentum. It's unbearable for those who rely on control. I understood both instincts well enough to know that patience, in this case, was an act of pressure. By the second day, the messages had grown urgent. Calls came at odd hours. Voicemails stacked up, each one shorter, sharper, edged with something close to panic. I didn't listen to them. I didn't need their words to tell me what had happened. I could already see it in the digital traces. Access attempts, failed logins, requests routed to new channels. The illusion was cracking. I pictured my daughter-in-law, pacing phone in hand, trying to understand why certainty had evaporated overnight. She would be replaying recent conversations, searching for a mistake, a warning sign she had missed. Her confidence would be working against her, now insisting that this couldn't be happening, that there must be an error. My son, I imagined, would be quieter, confused, trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with what he was suddenly experiencing. He would be discovering for the first time that comfort had shielded him from understanding how things really worked. I felt no satisfaction in imagining their fear. What I felt was distance. Distance changes perspective. It strips situations of their emotional noise and leaves only structure behind. From where I stood, everything made sense. Cause and effect, action and response. I had removed myself, and in doing so, I had removed their leverage. They could no longer frame me as upset because they couldn't reach me. They couldn't smooth things over because there was no one to negotiate with. They were left alone with the systems they had taken for granted. Absence became the loudest thing in the room. By the third day, I knew they were afraid. Not because of anything they said, but because of what they stopped saying. The messages lost their edge. Demands dissolved into requests. Certainty gave way to questions that no one could answer quickly. Fear doesn't announce itself. It seeps in through tone, through hesitation, through the sudden realization that control is conditional. They had never allowed me uncertainty. Now, they were living inside it. I thought briefly about reaching out, about easing the tension, about clarifying my intentions. The impulse passed. Intervention would only blunt the lesson. They needed to feel the full weight of not knowing. That weight was light compared to what I had carried for years, but it was new to them. I spent my time walking, thinking, observing. The world felt wider, without the constant hum of expectation. I noticed small things again. The way people move when no one is watching. The way time slows when you aren't managing someone else's comfort. This was what autonomy felt like. Disappearance had stripped me down to essentials. No role to perform, no image to maintain. Just choices made quietly without oversight. I understood then that absence is a weapon only when someone has relied on your presence to maintain power over you. By stepping away, I had reversed that equation. They were searching for me. I wasn't hiding. I was watching. And while they scrambled to restore the illusion of control, the systems they depended on were already adjusting, indifferent to their urgency. That was the part they couldn't see yet. The way process continues even when people panic. The way consequences arrive without raising their voice. As the day faded into evening, I sat by the window again, the city lights coming on one by one. Somewhere phones were ringing. Questions were being asked. Assumptions were collapsing. I felt steady. Disappearing hadn't made me smaller. It had made me precise. I hadn't vanished to punish anyone. I'd stepped back so the truth could move forward without interference. And while they searched for answers, the correction they never believed possible was already on its way. Silence had done its work. The next sound they would hear wouldn't be my voice. It would be the system responding exactly as it was designed to do. I didn't choose the days out of emotion. That morning had been circled in my mind long before the dinner table incident, long before my disappearance unsettled them. Timing mattered. Not for drama, but for precision. Systems respond best when they are least expected to be challenged, when routines have hardened into assumptions. I woke early before the city stirred and sat quietly with a cup of coffee reviewing nothing more than confirmations I already knew would be there. There was no rush, no adrenaline, just the steady awareness that something irreversible was about to occur. The first notification arrived without ceremony. A simple acknowledgement. Dry language, neutral tone, one account restricted. No alarms, no red flags, just a system recognizing that authority had changed. I didn't smile, I watched. What followed wasn't a collapse so much as a recalibration. One switch triggered another. Access paused. Permissions revoked. Operating privileges reassigned. Each action small on its own, each one necessary, each one entirely legal. Dominoes don't fall because they're pushed. They fall because they were aligned that way from the start. I had designed it carefully. Not to punish, but to correct. Nothing disappeared. Nothing was stolen. Control simply returned to where it had always belonged, waiting quietly for the moment it was needed again. From the outside, it would look sudden. Cards declined. Logins failed. Transfers frozen. The kind of inconveniences that feel catastrophic when you've never questioned your right to convenience. I imagined the confusion setting in almost immediately. The reflex to blame technology, to assume error, to expect resolution with a phone call. That expectation would be their first lesson. Money didn't vanish. It became inaccessible. Authority didn't evaporate. It reverted. What they experienced as loss was in reality the end of an illusion they had lived inside for years. I knew the moment their world stopped making sense. Not because I heard from them, but because silence shifted. The calls that had been frantic days earlier slowed, then stopped altogether. Panic has a rhythm. It accelerates until it hits a wall, then collapses inward. That wall was reality. I thought about my son in that moment, standing in front of screens that no longer responded to him, realizing that the titles he wore had conditions attached he had never bothered to read. I felt no triumph in that image, only a quiet sadness. He had mistaken comfort for security. My daughter-in-law, I imagined, would be less quiet. She would be moving quickly, checking accounts, making calls, demanding explanations. Control hates interruption. It panics when it discovers it was never absolute. She would learn something important that morning. Systems don't respond to tone, they respond to authority. And authority, she would discover, had limits she never saw because she never needed to. I didn't call them. I didn't text. I didn't explain. Explanations invite negotiation. Negotiation implies doubt. I had none. Contracts speak more clearly than arguments ever could. They don't raise their voice. They don't soften their message. They simply execute. By midday, the consequences had reached beyond finances. Plans canceled. Obligations unmet. Questions raised by people who had never questioned them before. When money smooths everything, its absence roughens the surface quickly. Status is fragile when it's funded. I sat quietly, letting the day pass, observing the ripples without inserting myself into them. This wasn't something I needed to witness directly. I had seen this kind of collapse before in boardrooms and negotiations where one party suddenly realizes they no longer control the terms. The shock always comes first. Then, disbelief. Then the frantic search for leverage that no longer exists. They would reach out eventually. They would demand answers. They would accuse, plead, threaten, apologize. The order would vary, but the outcome would be the same. I owed them nothing. This wasn't vengeance. It was resolution. Everything I reclaimed had been built with my name, my risk, my responsibility. Allowing it to be misused indefinitely would have been the real failure. Correcting that misuse was not cruelty. It was stewardship. I felt something settle inside me as the day wore on. Not satisfaction, alignment. For the first time in years, reality matched principle. Authority rested where accountability lived. Respect no longer needed to be requested because it had been enforced structurally. By evening, the full scope of what had happened would be undeniable. There would be no workaround, no quick fix, no apology sufficient to reverse it. Systems don't care about remorse. They care about compliance. I closed my laptop and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker on. Somewhere, my son and his wife were confronting a truth they had never believed applied to them. What they thought was theirs had only ever been borrowed. I didn't feel victorious. Victories imply competition. This felt more like returning something to its proper place. Control had come home. They would spend the night trying to understand how it happened, replaying conversations, searching for warnings they had ignored. They would tell themselves stories to soften the impact. That I had overreacted. That I had gone too far. that I would change my mind. They didn't understand yet that this wasn't about anger. It was about boundaries. I had been patient. I had been generous. I had been silent long enough to be mistaken for harmless. That misunderstanding was now corrected. As darkness settled outside, I turned off the lights and sat in the quiet, aware that the hardest part for them was still ahead. Not the loss of money, but the loss of certainty. The realization that power is conditional and respect is not automatic. They had built their lives on the assumption that I would never dare. They were right about one thing. I hadn't dared. I had acted. And once action replaces assumption, there is no going back. The panic traveled faster than I expected. It moved through phone calls and messages, through hurried conversations and unanswered questions, spreading outward from the center where certainty had collapsed. I didn't hear it directly. I felt it in the sudden change of rhythm, the way silence replaced insistence, the way confidence dissolved into urgency. My phone stayed off. I didn't need to read the messages to know what they said. I had seen this pattern before. When power evaporates, people reach for the nearest explanation. When explanations fail, they reach for the person they believe can restore order. That person used to be me. Now I was unreachable. What struck me most was how quickly money stopped protecting them. The insulation they had relied on for years vanished in a matter of hours. Plans unraveled. Commitments became questions. People who once returned calls immediately suddenly needed time. Money has a way of creating the illusion that relationships are stable. When it disappears, so does the patience. I imagined my daughter-in-law discovering that her confidence no longer carried weight. Her tone once assured now landing flat. Her certainty once unchallenged now met with procedural language and waiting periods. She had always believed authority was something you assert. She was learning that authority is something you are granted and it can be withdrawn. My son's experience would be different, quieter, more disorienting. He would be staring at documents he had never truly read, realizing that his name on the line did not mean what he thought it meant. He would be forced to confront the difference between being trusted to operate something and being entrusted with its ownership. That realization would hurt. I felt that pain for him, even as I refused to intervene. Sympathy does not require rescue. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is let someone face the consequences of their assumptions. By the second day, the fallout had expanded beyond their immediate circle. Questions came from people they hadn't anticipated needing to answer. Associates who had enjoyed the benefits of proximity began to distance themselves. Invitations were quietly withdrawn, meetings postponed. Status, I had learned long ago, is not a possession. It's a condition maintained by access and confidence. Remove either, and it fades quickly. My daughter-in-law's armor had always been certainty. She spoke as if outcomes were guaranteed, as if her position were permanent. Now, stripped of that certainty, she would be exposed in ways she had never experienced. I didn't take pleasure in that. What I felt was distance, emotional, intellectual, moral. I was no longer inside the situation reacting to it. I was observing it from a place where it could no longer touch me. That distance was something I hadn't realized I needed. The messages changed again. Where there had been panic, there was now strategy. Carefully worded appeals, attempts to reframe what had happened as a misunderstanding, offers to talk, to explain, to fix things. I ignored all of it. Silence at this stage was not cruelty. It was clarity. Any response from me would have shifted the focus back to emotion, to narrative, to blame. I wanted the focus to remain exactly where it belonged. On reality. Money once removed reveals character quickly. People show you what they value when they can no longer purchase comfort. I had seen that truth play out in business dozens of times. Seeing it in my own family was painful, but not surprising. The most telling change came when the demands stopped entirely. No more accusations, no more implied entitlement, just questions, confusion. The dawning realization that they were no longer in a position to dictate terms. That was the moment power truly shifted. I thought back to the dinner table, to the confidence in my daughter-in-law's voice when she said I would never dare. That confidence had been built on the assumption that money was untouchable and that I was irrelevant. Both assumptions had collapsed. Yet even then, I didn't feel vindicated. Vindication suggests a contest, a winner and a loser. What I felt was alignment, a sense that things had returned to their proper order. I had never wanted to dominate them. I had wanted to be respected. When respect failed, structure stepped in to do what emotion could not. By the third day, the social consequences were undeniable. Without access, without the ability to smooth things over, relationships strained. People who had been friendly became cautious. People who had been loyal became distant. It wasn't personal. It was practical. I remembered telling my son years earlier that money amplifies who you already are. Without it, there is nowhere to hide. Watching that lesson unfold was difficult, but necessary. Still, I said nothing. I didn't step in to clarify, to soften, to guide. That would have undermined everything. Rescue would have restored the illusion that consequences are optional, that authority can be negotiated through emotion. I wasn't interested in teaching lessons anymore. I was interested in setting boundaries. As the days passed, I felt something else change within me. The tension I had carried for years began to ease. The constant vigilance, the careful monitoring of my words, the quiet calculation of how much space I was allowed to take up, all of it faded. I slept better. I walked more. I noticed things again. The rhythm of my own life uninterrupted. This, I realized, was what freedom felt like. I thought briefly about reaching out to my son, about offering reassurance, about explaining that this wasn't meant to destroy him. The thought passed. Explanation would come later if it came at all. Right now, clarity mattered more than comfort. Consequences don't argue. They don't explain themselves. They simply arrive and wait to be acknowledged. By the end of the week, the panic had settled into something heavier. Acceptance, perhaps, or resignation. The realization that the world they had been living in was gone, replaced by one that required humility. That was the hardest part for them, I knew. Not the loss of money, but the loss of certainty. The understanding that power is conditional and that respect cannot be assumed. I stood by the window one evening, watching the light fade, and felt no urge to gloat, no desire to return and survey the damage. I hadn't done this to punish them. I had done it to stop being punished myself. The money had never been the point. It had only been the language they understood. Without it, everything else had been revealed. Soon I would speak again, not to negotiate, not to apologize, but to close the door properly on my terms. For now, silence remained the most honest response. They were learning something I had known my entire life. When money can no longer protect you, only character remains. And character, once exposed, cannot be hidden again. I didn't come back because I missed them. I came back because uncertainty has a shelf life, and I was the only one who could decide when it expired. Silence had done what it needed to do. The systems had corrected themselves. The panic had settled into something quieter, heavier. Now it was time to close the door properly. I chose the moment carefully, not too soon when emotions were still raw and defensive, not too late when resentment might harden into something useless. I waited until the noise faded, until the questions stopped multiplying, until the absence of answers became its own answer. When I reached out, I didn't apologize for disappearing. I didn't explain myself. I set conditions. We would speak calmly. We would speak briefly. And we would speak without theatrics. They agreed immediately. That alone told me how much had changed. We met in a neutral place, not the house that had once confined me, not anywhere heavy with memory or ownership. I arrived early and sat quietly watching people move through their lives, each of them absorbed in concerns that had nothing to do with mine. When my son walked in, I barely recognized the way he carried himself. His shoulders were tighter, his confidence less practiced. He looked older in a way that had nothing to do with time. My daughter-in-law followed a few steps behind him. She was composed, but it was a brittle kind of composure, carefully assembled and easy to crack. The armor she used to wear so effortlessly no longer fit. We exchanged greetings. Polite, controlled. No one reached across the table. I didn't waste time. "I'm not here to argue," I said. My voice was steady, almost gentle. "And I'm not here to be forgiven." They waited, unsure how to respond without overstepping. I told them exactly what had happened without commentary or emotion. What authority had been withdrawn, why access had changed, which decisions had triggered the safeguards. I spoke in facts, not accusations. There was no anger in my voice, no satisfaction, just clarity. My daughter-in-law tried to interrupt, once a reflex, more than an intention. I raised my hand slightly, not sharply, just enough to signal that the interruption wasn't welcome. She stopped. That moment said more than any argument ever could. I didn't justify my actions. I didn't defend my intentions. Justification invites debate. Debate implies uncertainty. I had none. I watched them listen, really listen, for the first time in years. Not because they suddenly respected me as a father, but because the leverage they once held was gone. When power shifts, attention follows. My son looked down at his hands as I spoke. I could see the weight settling in him, the understanding that this wasn't a misunderstanding or a temporary setback. This was a correction. "I should have paid attention," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. I didn't respond to that. Regret, when it arrives this late, belongs to the person carrying it. It isn't something you can take away. When I finished, I outlined the boundaries that would govern whatever relationship remained between us. There would be no financial dependence going forward. Not for them, not for me. Our lives would operate separately, with transparency and respect as the minimum requirement for any contact. There would be no commentary on my choices, no oversight disguised as concern. My independence was not a topic for discussion. There would be no access to me through obligation. Visits would be invitations, not expectations. Silence would be accepted, not questioned. I didn't frame these boundaries as punishment. I framed them as conditions, the same way I always had, long before any of this happened. My daughter-in-law listened without interruption this time. When I finished, she nodded slowly. I couldn't tell if she agreed or simply understood that agreement was no longer required. She asked one question, careful and restrained. "Is there any way things can go back to how they were?" I met her eyes for the first time. "No," I said, because how they were wasn't working. That was the truth stripped of cruelty. I didn't ask for gratitude. Gratitude forced by loss is meaningless. I didn't ask for apologies. Apologies offered under pressure are rarely sincere. I asked for nothing. What I wanted had already been restored. As the meeting drew to a close, I stood without ceremony. There was no dramatic farewell, no final speech. I had said what needed to be said. Anything more would have diluted it. My son stood as well, uncertainty flickering across his face. For a moment I thought he might reach for me, say something unplanned, ask for reassurance I wasn't prepared to give. He didn't. Instead, he nodded, a small gesture heavy with understanding. I returned it and turned to leave. Walking away felt different this time, lighter, final in a way that wasn't painful. I wasn't leaving out of rejection or anger. I was leaving because the conversation was complete. Outside, the air felt clearer. I took a breath and realized that, for the first time in years, I wasn't bracing myself for the next interaction. I wasn't calculating how much space I was allowed to take up. I was simply myself. I hadn't come back to be loved. Love without respect becomes another form of control. I had learned that too late, but not too late to do something about it. I had come back to be seen clearly, and whether they chose to understand that or not was no longer my responsibility. As I walked away, I felt no bitterness, no urge to revisit the past or rewrite it in kinder terms. The story was what it was, and it had reached its conclusion. Some endings come with noise and conflict. Others arrive quietly, like a door closing at exactly the right moment. This one was quiet. I didn't look back. There was nothing left behind that belonged to me. I had reclaimed my dignity, set my boundaries, and spoken my truth without raising my voice. That was enough. And for the first time in a long while, I knew I would sleep well. Not because everything was resolved, but because everything that mattered finally was. Life grew quieter after that. Not empty, just calmer. The kind of quiet that settles in when no one is measuring you anymore, when no one is waiting to see what you'll do next, so they can react to it. I woke up when I wanted. I ate when I was hungry. I made decisions without rehearsing explanations in my head. For years I had lived inside other people's expectations. I hadn't noticed how loud they were until they disappeared. The days found a rhythm of their own. Morning walks, simple meals, long stretches of time where nothing demanded my approval or compliance. I didn't miss the house I left behind. I missed the version of myself I had almost forgotten. Disappearing gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Space. Not just physical space, but mental space. The room to think without being corrected, to choose without being questioned, to exist without being managed. People like to believe that walking away is weakness, that staying and enduring proves character. I believed that for a long time. What I learned instead was that endurance without respect slowly erases you. Leaving restored me. I didn't regain everything. Some things don't come back once they've been reshaped. But what I took with me mattered more than what I left behind. My time, my autonomy, my sense of self. The money, despite everything that happened, was never the point. It was leverage. It was language. It was the only thing that cut through certainty when certainty had become arrogance. Without it, nothing else I said would have mattered. What I reclaimed wasn't wealth. It was balance. I thought often about my grandson during those weeks, about the gift that started all of this, even if no one ever acknowledged it out loud. I hoped quietly that one day he would understand what it represented. Not the investment itself, but the idea behind it. That patience compounds. That value grows when you let it. That independence is something you protect, not something you apologize for. I didn't walk away from him. I never would. Some connections aren't tied to power or permission. They exist on a different level, untouched by the conflicts of adults who forgot why they started building in the first place. Legacy isn't about inheritance fights or control. It's about example, about what people learn by watching how you handle being underestimated. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that love without respect eventually turns into obligation. An obligation over time becomes resentment. Respect doesn't need to be demanded, but when it disappears, it has to be addressed. Quietly, firmly, without apology. That's what disappearing gave me. The clarity to see when staying was costing me more than leaving ever could. I tell this story now not because I'm proud of what happened, but because I know I'm not alone. There are people listening who have swallowed their words for years, who have been made smaller in the name of family harmony, who have confused patience with virtue because that's what they were taught to do. If that sounds familiar, I don't have advice for you. Everyone's situation is different. What I do have is perspective. You're not wrong for wanting respect. You're not selfish for setting boundaries. And silence, when used deliberately, can be more powerful than any argument you'll ever make. Walking away doesn't always mean ending relationships. Sometimes it just means ending a version of yourself that no longer serves you. I didn't disappear to punish anyone. I disappeared to stop punishing myself. And when I came back whole. If this story stirred something in you, If it reminded you of a moment when you were underestimated or taken for granted, I'd like to hear about it. Not for judgment, not for advice, just to know you're out there. Stories like this don't exist in isolation. They echo across families, across years, across quiet dinners where words are swallowed and smiles are forced. If you've lived something similar, share it in the comments. Sometimes naming the experience is the first step toward reclaiming yourself. And if you want to stay with this channel, there are more stories ahead. Stories about dignity reclaimed, about quiet justice, about people who stopped shrinking and started living on their own terms. If this resonated, consider liking the video so it reaches others who might need it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Not for drama, but for stories that remind us we're allowed to choose ourselves. The money was never the point. It was the moment I realized I didn't need permission to be whole. That realization changed everything. And if you're listening, maybe it can change something for you too.